It's Baxie's musical podcast.
Resistance is useless!
In the 1990s, while grunge was busy blowing things up like music charts and radio station playlists across the United States, the UK were being dominated by something very different, something a whole lot more British, with a whole lot less flannel. Instead, the UK was being swept up in something that was a little less dark, a little less moody, but every bit as relevant as grunge was here in the US. While grunge was serving as a bridge that brought alternative music into the mainstream, the same thing was being accomplished in Great Britain by bands like Blur, Suede, Pulp, and Oasis. The music had been labeled Britpop, and the mania which surrounded it caused some of the most heated musical debates in years. This was particularly the case between Oasis and Blur. On one hand, these bands couldn't have been more different. The styles, the influences, their backgrounds were fundamentally coming from opposite directions. And yet, the rivalry between these two bands, which may or may not have been a creation of the British music press, was so intense that they're still talking about it 30 years later. The fact of the matter is, between the two of them, Oasis and Blur sold a lot of freaking records, especially in August of 1995, when both released singles on the very same day, with Blur squeezing into the number one spot over Oasis by just less than 90,000 records sold. And people ate that shit up. But the Blur story isn't just about Oasis or Britpop. The Blur story is about a band that went from being totally broke to being one of the biggest selling bands in UK history. Period. This is a band that released 8 albums, 35 singles, 26 of which reached the British top 40. All total, Blur has sold more than 26 million records worldwide. This is a band whose songs such as Park Life and Girls and Boys and Country House are still considered classics, and their 1997 single entitled Song 2 is a bona fide anthem, which is being played in sports stadiums and arenas all around the world. In July, Blur will be playing at Wembley Stadium in London, 90,000 seats, which sold out in 2 minutes. In fact, the demand was so great, they added another show due to the intense demand, which is part of their first European tour in years. But the guys from Blur have hardly been sitting around doing nothing. For example, since the band went largely idle in 2006, drummer Dave Rowntree became a lawyer, an animator, a pilot, and a politician. He's also just released his very first solo album entitled Radio Songs, and it's fantastic. In fact, it's received 4-star reviews in both the London Times and in Rolling Stone magazine. So in a very real way, Dave Rowntree's life outside the spotlight is every bit as rich and as diverse as the one he enjoyed inside of it. And so it's been a real treat to talk to my guest today, attorney Dave Rowntree from Blur on Baxie's musical podcast.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm great. How are you doing?
Good too, thank you.
I read something the other day about Blur. I just could not wrap my head around it. You guys, you got Wembley Stadium coming up in July. It's got 90,000 seats, and you sell it out in 2 minutes. Is that correct?
Yeah, the thrust of it's correct. I'm not sure the numbers are exactly right. I think it's 70,000 seats, and in fact, there's 2 Wembleys, and we sold out the first in a few minutes. Yeah.
Oh, that's a whole lot more easy to understand. You're absolutely right. I
know that took us by surprise as well, I have to say.
How do you even wrap your head around the speed and the numbers of that? I mean, you guys haven't had a new record out in quite a few years, and here you are, 70,000 seats in a matter of minutes. That's extraordinary.
Well, I think that's probably why we haven't played in a long time. You know, people, sort of big, spectacular gigs are far more popular than little grassroots gigs at the moment. That's what people want to see, is things like Blur getting back together again, Pulp getting back together again. They've just done a similar thing. Lots of bands from the 80s getting back together again. And that's what people want to see. Bands they know, they want to hear, songs they know. That's kind of what's big at the moment. So, but it was a gamble, you know. There's no guarantee that anyone was going to be interested, and it took us by as much by surprise as it did everybody else, I think.
It's very clear you guys have come a long way from just after the release of Leisure, when you guys could barely afford lunch, and now here you are
Yeah.
at Wembley. I've been listening to the new record the last couple of weeks, Radio Songs, and I have to say it is a beautiful, tender record, and you cannot find anywhere a single bad review of this record. People are just flipping out over it. It's just incredible. Congratulations on this record.
Thank you so much. That's the nicest thing anybody's ever said about it. You can stay. In fact, let's just carry on doing for the rest of the day. Let's carry on doing this.
Well, I thought I'd get that Wembley thing out of the way and then really talk about Dave Rowntree. I think that was a whole lot more interesting. But this record is really something. I'm going to assume as a part of you that's really happy the Gallagher brothers didn't release something in the very same day.
It was mooted, the idea of the Gallagher brothers, at least one or the other of them, supporting us at Wembley. Yeah. That was a kind of 3 a.m. idea somebody had. The wiser minds prevailed, I think.
I think what I love about this record is, there's a number of things I love on it. I love Devil's Island and London Bridge and 1,000 Miles, but I think what I really respect most about it is, I mean, you're known primarily as a drummer, and this is definitely not a drummer's album. I mean, there are melodies and hooks, and there's no temptation to drop a 15-minute drum solo in the middle of all this. It's something very, very different, and I think that's actually pretty commendable. There was something about this record that meant more to you than just showing off the fact that you're an incredibly great drummer.
Well, I've been, I don't think I've got much to prove in terms of drumming. I do what I do. People know how I play the drums. And it's not really, it wouldn't have been a very interesting project for me, a kind of drum-based project. And I didn't want to do the obvious things. It was less clear what that left me with. I wanted to surprise people. But fundamentally, I see myself as a musician first, as a drummer second, really. And what I like in music is tunes. I'm a sucker for a tune. So, I thought I'd try and make an album that I would want to listen to. And I think, where I arrived at what would be a surprising album to make would be that, as long as I didn't make a sort of traditional drummy album with drummy things, guitar, bass and drums kind of album, a sort of a rock album, as long as I didn't do that, it would be, that would kind of fit the bill, really.
And that's why I say it, because the end result is it's a very listenable album. There's something very emotional about it. It's ambient in a way. And some of these songs, London Bridge would be a perfect example. It's like you can get the hook stuck in your head without waiting for that Phil Collins drum solo in the air tonight. You don't have to wait for that. And I think that was really commendable because I play drums too, and I know that the inclination for me would be to take those quieter moments and then fuck it all up with a drum solo.
Yeah, but I guess that's not the kind of drumming I do with Blur,
No.
I believe in kind of understating these things, especially on record. So, the temptation was never there to do that kind of thing. There are some drums on it, but it's pretty sparse. 1,000 Miles is the only one really with a drum part from beginning to end. But that's just how we wrote it. I didn't plan it being that way. I wrote it in Iceland in this beautiful studio in Reykjavik with a friend of mine, and we hadn't discussed what we were going to do. We just turned up at this studio. In the live room, there happened to be a drum kit set up at one end and a piano set up at the other end. So I sat at the drum kit, he sat at the piano, and we wrote this song. So it wasn't planned that way. I didn't run a million miles from the drum kit when it was there. It seemed quite a natural thing to do. But other than that, really, there's lots of it's an electronic album, really, and it's electronic album because that I'm in my spare room at the moment where I've moved the studio to. I've got we've got some Ukrainian refugees living with us at the moment, so I've shifted all my stuff out of the studio and moved them in there, so there's a lot more space. But ordinarily in my studio, I have instruments to make film soundtracks with. That's what I do, for my day job and have done for the past decade or so. So that's, you don't use drum kits on film soundtracks unless they're a very weird film. So, I have those instruments. It give the record its texture, really.
I want to get into some of the things that you do outside of music because I find that to be absolutely fascinating, and I will get to that in a second. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting about the record, and especially your radio songs, even the title and the motif of the whole record is the inspiration that you drew from these moments of between you and your dad putting together radio kits at the kitchen table. It sounded like that was a really important set of moments for you in a situation where you have a very complicated relationship with your dad. Tell me a little bit about that and how that informed making this record.
Yeah, I come from an archetypical dysfunctional family, really. One of the fond memories I have, one of the kind of glues that glued the relationship together with me and my father is his love of radio and love of electronics. He was a radio engineer in the Air Force when he was a young man, and he kept that love of radio and radio engineering alive for his entire life, really. And so he and I would sit around the kitchen table talking about and designing and building radios, and then plugging them into this big antenna we had in the back garden, and spinning the dial and tuning in stations from around the world. And that's something I've always loved to do ever since then. He inspired in me a love of electronics. And to this day, I still tinker with radios, build radios, play with radios. Radio technology I've always absolutely loved and had a passion for. So yeah, that was the sort of backdrop, really. I mean, the radio technology was the backdrop for the album, really, as much as building radios with my father. But it's inspired me in many, many different ways, really. It's been a kind of constant in my life. For example, it was my political awakening of sorts, I guess, because many foreign language stations or national foreign stations also do news transmissions in English as part of their soft power efforts. And so I come from quite a traditional south of England family, kind of centre-right politics, and my dad ended up working for the BBC, which is, a very kind of mainstream organisation. And so we were getting a very homogenous, shall we say, news feed through from all the various news sources, and it never really occurred to me that wasn't simply the truth, and that there might be any other alternatives to those news sources that I was getting. And it was listening to these foreign language English broadcasts of the news, when I was a young kid. That was a real wake-up call. It was like, oh, I see. So the news I'm getting isn't necessarily the only interpretation of these events. Other people may have other ideas about what all this means. So that was the start of my journey to the centre left, I guess, from the centre right, and I bounced on through the centre left quite far to the left in my young days.
But that's a remarkable experience to have because, even here in the States, we have our various biased news organizations. And, unless you actively go out and look for other interpretations and other, trains of thought, you may not even realize that there are other interpretations out there.
And it doesn't mean you have to agree with those other interpretations, but it does challenge you to look again at the interpretations you're being given at home and examine them a bit more critically, and that kind of critical thinking, as I say, it led me to question what I actually did believe, and that it made me reject the kind of centre-right politics of my parents and move further to the left. And that's something, that's happened again and again in life, really. I mean, we definitely, as a band, found that we didn't really know our home, where we came from. We didn't really know the England and Great Britain particularly well until we left it. It was when we we did a 6 month tour of America, or God knows how many months it was. It felt like about 6 years, but we spent considerable amount of time trying to break America, something we never succeeded in doing. But we were shipped off by the record company, and we all got sort of homesick in different ways. And it's very different touring somewhere as different as America. You think that going to a country like France or Germany that doesn't speak English would mean that those sort of places would be very different. But in fact, they say Americans and English are divided by a common language, and that's kind of, something that
Right.
we've definitely felt like we'd landed on a different planet in the States, when the values were different, and the way of life was different, and the kind of the culture is very different, and it made us look again at the UK and kind of think, well, what do we like about England, and what don't we like about England? And so we had the similar kind of thought process all over again, really, as young men, and that kind of led us to quite dramatically change our sound and the kind of music we decided we were going to make.
I watched a couple of documentaries on YouTube about the band, and the description of you guys in the U.S. sounds like it had to have been horrifying. It sounds like it was terrible, and I don't know if it was just a matter of if it was just homesick, or whether the music culture was in a different place. What is the truth of that?
No, actually, America was very kind to us. I think the problem was, the reality was, our first manager had just taken all our money, stolen all our money effectively, and put everything in his wife's name and declared himself bankrupt, something it turns out he'd done previously. So we were absolutely broke. One of the band was nearly over at that point, as you can imagine. And one of the ways we dug ourselves out of that hole is we signed a merchandising deal with a UK merchandiser, on the condition that we go and tour outside the UK for about 6 months, I think it was. And so we spent a lot of that time in America, and it was the wrong time to tour America. We weren't very well known even in the UK, and that's probably where we should have spent the 6 months touring. So we were playing an awful lot of venues, a lot of travel from venue to venue, playing sort of half-empty clubs, and people didn't know our name. We were very, very underground, and it was just while we had America was very, very kind to us. We should have been a lot more grateful than we were, but that was the reality of it. We were kind of forced away from home to do a tour that really, it was painfully obvious, was a bit of a waste of time, both for us and for the American audiences. So that was that. If there was a downside, it was that, really, But the upsides were we got to know America very well. We had some fantastic experiences. We did play some great gigs. They weren't all half empty, but rather too many of them were.
Well, it's interesting that you say when you came back, you realize, you don't realize, where you come from until you're gone. One of the things I think is so interesting about Blur's music is that it's so unapologetically British, in the same way that, like, Ray Davies was with the Kinks, or, Paul Weller was with the Jam, or it's like for every, songs like Park Life or Country House, those are very, very British songs, unlike like Song 2 or Girls and Boys, where it that did kind of resonate with people in the States. The bulk of what you did was very clear. This was not an American type of leaning band.
Well, that was certainly a phase we went through. At the end of that American tour, we came home and we thought, well, what actually does English pop music sound like? What does English rock music sound like? When you sort of trace the genesis of pop music in the UK, so much of it starts in America, doesn't it? With blues and rock and roll and all of those things that England just kind of imported, lock, stock and barrel. Like the Stones and the Beatles, they were, especially the Stones, they were a copycat blues band when they started, when they were playing blues covers, and the Beatles kind of also imported a whole, very similar. What they were playing in Liverpool in the Cavern wasn't what they ended up playing, in Abbey Road. it was American rock and roll, American blues, and kind of. So we think, well, had there not been the Second World War and the kind of wholesale importation of American culture, what would English music have sounded like? What's England's contribution to all of that? And that's when we started listening to the Kinks and the Who and other bands, and thinking, well, is there that kind of that was sort of genesis of the us changing our music and kind of experimenting with that. It was a phase we went through where we got bored with that after an album or two, really, and just started playing with other things. Our music got more experimental. We went back to crashing guitars again, because that's really leaping around on stage is what inspired us. But it was an interesting idea, and I think it took us to some interesting places. But we're not doing that now. We're not toying with Englishness now. That was all a long time ago,
But isn't it funny though? And I don't even know how people in the UK truly appreciate this. Americans didn't really learn much about blues until the English guys started to do it and do it better. And then at that point, we're like, wow, this blues stuff, where does this come from? It's like, well, it's ours. Didn't even realize that.
The English, because it was so hard to get all of that stuff, especially the blues records in the UK, they were absolutely treasured here. The albums were all imported. And that, when somebody managed to import a new one that nobody had heard, everybody came to listen to it. That's how I understand it went. So it went from a kind of a culture perhaps not revered at the time in the States to a culture immediately revered in the UK, and then perhaps fed back again. So it's funny how these things work, isn't it?
You mentioned the destitution you guys were suffering early on with their manager, basically, wiping you guys dry. But then all of a sudden, things start to really turn around to a degree where I don't think many of us in the States can totally understand it. The kind of mania that was following you guys around, following Oasis around. I know there's been a lot made of the whole Brit-pop war between you guys and Oasis. And I know that oftentimes these things are created by the media, whether it's to increase sales or, circulation of magazines, whatever it may be. As a guy who was in the mix of all of this whole thing between you guys and Oasis, what is the truth of what happened? Was there really this rivalry between you guys, or was it really just like a media fabrication?
It was you have to put it into context of the music industry in the UK at the time. There were at one point there was 4 weekly broadsheet music newspapers, desperate for column inches, desperate for things to print, because there wasn't that much music going on for all of these papers to fill it up. So the more kind of gossipy, kind of nonsense stories were really the mainstay of these papers. So people slagging each other off, people sleeping with each other's girlfriends, people kind of falling drunk out of clubs, people getting into fights. That's what these newspapers were full of. Because what can you say about music? Fundamentally, it's very hard to write about music, isn't it? So they were all full of tittle-tattle, really. It's just kind of nonsense. And so we were the journalist's dream, because we would slag off anyone. We didn't care, If you had a record out, we hated it. If you did a gig, we thought it was crap. That was that got us. I mean, genuinely, that was what we were like. We were desperate to kind of climb to the top of the heap. We just thought we deserved it, and nobody else did. The arrogance of the kind of 20-year-old man, really. But anyway, so the journalists lapped that up, and of course, eventually we bumped up against Oasis, who were just as much a bunch of loudmouths as we were, and they gave it back to us. Nobody had ever done that before. We'd come up with kind of witty ways of belittling all of these other bands, and they'd all kind of run away and hid. And Oasis were like, bring it on. So, the war of words was instigated by the two bands, amplified by the media. and then brought to a head when we released our single on the same day. A marketing idea that we should have really won an award for, but anyway, we didn't. But after that, it kind of fizzled out. The upside of it was that it pushed both bands into the mainstream, really pushed us both to the bottom rung of a very long ladder, which we've both been climbing ever since. But the downside is, I guess, we've both been stapled at the hip, really. We're not very similar bands, but, you know, I know in every interview I do since, for the last, God knows how long, 30 years, they've asked me the Oasis question. I have absolutely no doubt they've asked them the Blur question.
Of course they have. Of course. But how do you not ask it? You know, that's the thing. If I don't ask it, people say, "Well, you should have asked them about Oasis." Yeah, I know I should have. But you know,
I'm fine with it. You know, I'm absolutely fine with it. I don't mind talk about anything. I don't care.
But to have that kind of mania, whether it's, you know, whether again it's the media or the fans that are lapping it up or whatever, you guys are at that point in your career selling a hell of a lot of records. And suddenly, like you said, you guys go from having no money to being destitute to suddenly there's success. And even though it took a long time to get there, sometimes, you know, that moment between struggle and success is like as quick as flipping a light switch. For a lot of people that go through that experience, they often find it kind of difficult to manage. And in a way, you know, I hear people trying to grab for every coping mechanism they can. Some of them are healthy, and oftentimes they're not. It could be drugs or alcohol. And certainly you've not been immune to that. You've had those kinds of issues before. Tell me a little bit about trying to manage that kind of success. You're a young guy, you're in your 20s, and all of a sudden you're all over the place. Tell me about that if you can.
Actually, you know, I didn't struggle. I've never struggled with successes. You know, that's always felt very natural. It's failure that I've always struggled with. That always feels very unfair. So there's a kind of inequality of arms there, I think. But yeah, and while I guess our notoriety certainly increased, our finances didn't improve for decades. You know, the kind of record deal we were signed under meant that we didn't really see any money from selling records for 20 years, really. It wasn't really till the band stopped releasing records and the record company were no longer able to charge promotional items to our account that we finally finally started making any money. And that was relatively recently, you know, in the history of the band. So but yeah, it was, and the kind of the fame from the Battle of Britpop faded relatively quickly. You know, peaked at us winning a lot of awards. You know, we were on the front of all the magazines and everything, but pretty soon you're kind of yesterday's news, and they move on to something else, and that was probably for the best. You know, because some of us in the band were quite comfortable with that kind of, you know, being sort of teenage heartthrobs. Others of us in the band weren't comfortable with that at all. So, you know, I was always relatively comfortable with whatever happened, but certainly didn't feel like that kind of crazy roller coaster. You know, in my film composing career, I worked on the Bros documentary, When the Screaming Stops. Bros were an 80s band who literally went from being, they were two very, very good looking young brothers, twin brothers, and they went literally from being nobodies to the biggest band in the country to nobodies in the space of about a year. You know, literally a couple of the most famous faces on the planet ever so briefly, you know, and they were damaged by that. Well, we never were. We were,
Yeah.
Our journey was much gentler than that. It's very hard to complain about it, really. And for me, it wasn't something I had to cope with. You know, I had other things going on that I had to cope with.
One of the things that I found in researching was that, and I mentioned this earlier, that the things that you've done outside of Blur are probably every bit as interesting as the stuff that you did in Blur, if not more so. So the band goes on hiatus. I think it's 2006 or somewhere around there, and then all of a sudden you become an attorney, and then you start working in a criminal department of a law firm. Suddenly you're into politics. Then you're a pilot. Then you're involved with NASA. All these things are going on, and it's not necessarily the direction that you expect out of most musicians. Tell me about what you were thinking as you're getting out of that spotlight and trying to make the most of what to do next.
Well, I've always done whatever seems interesting at the time. I've got no master plan, as you can tell from my CV. At different times in my life, I've been grabbed by the different enthusiasms, and definitely, when the band wound down, the first thing I thought was, well, I'll start another band, which I did for a little bit. But really, I thought, do I really want to start again from the bottom now when I've just come out of, that incredible experience? Do I really want to start again? And I was doing various other things. I had an animation company that I've been doing kind of in parallel. But anyway, I got through a long series of coincidences. I ended up working one day a week at a criminal legal aid, so a publicly funded criminal defence firm in East London, and just fell in love with the work they did there, and was just in awe of the lawyers that issued big city £1 million salaries to work with underprivileged people, and in low income families, low income areas, and try and defend them and see many of them obviously had done what they were accused of doing, so try and kind of help them through the system. If they're going to jail, try and help them with that. I just it's such worthwhile work. These are people despised by society, but often they've got where they've ended up through making poor choices, and God knows we've all done that. So there was an element of there, but for the grace of God go I. So anyway, I just thought it was so amazing what these people were doing. I started volunteering there. Eventually they said, do you want to work here? So well, nothing else to do, give it a go. As I say, it seemed interesting, and I got sucked into it really. I decided that in order to do it properly, I was going to have to qualify as a lawyer myself, which I did, and worked at that. Found a job at another firm and did that for about 5 years. So in total, so it was really, really interesting time. Very difficult to manage though, because by the time I'd qualified and was working at this firm, Blur had decided it was going to get back together again, and do some more shows. Well, I could just about manage that, because at the start we were just playing festivals, mostly at the weekend. So I would take my suit off on Friday afternoon, go down to Heathrow, get on a plane, go to a festival, play it on Saturday night, come home Sunday, come in Monday morning, put my suit back on and work as a lawyer. And that worked okay. It was manageable. I would have burnt out doing it eventually, because you can't work at that pace forever. And then we decided, for one reason or another, to put a record out, and that paid to that really. Making a record and releasing a record is a full-time job. There's no way you can be a lawyer at the same time as that. So I had to sadly choose between one or the other, and it was always going to be music. So that's really where my heart is. So, but I shall do something. That I learned a lot of useful skills, a lot of amazing life information that they should teach in schools. I mean, I learned how property works. How mortgages work, how pensions work, what a will is, all this kind of stuff that people don't actually know. Certainly I didn't know the ins and outs of all of that, and how the financial markets work, what a company is, how you start a company, all of that kind of stuff. It's like, wow, this is the secret information that they don't tell you in life. This is stuff about how the world actually works.
If you knew then what you know now, you never would have signed that first contract.
Well, we would have signed such a bad contract we signed, but we'd have done anything to be famous. We'd have done whatever it took.
It's kind of hard for me to imagine you're working on someone's criminal defense and you have to tell them, listen, you're going to have to spend some more time in jail because I'm going on tour. Sorry about the years in prison you're going to be spending, but music calls.
Yeah, well, that's what I had to avoid. When you're somebody's lawyer, you have to put them first in everything. Their interests come first, yours come second. That's the deal. So I wanted to avoid a situation where there was going to be some kind of conflict there. Somebody can turn around and say, or even if even if it would never have happened, but even for somebody to be able to say that's what it looked like, you skimped on that because you wanted to do this.
You also went into politics for a while, and I'm trying to read. It was like a county council seat that you had.
Yeah, so that's like the kind of, I suppose it's kind of like state politics in the States. It runs the big organizations like the fire service and the police service and schools and care homes and that kind of thing. So, I mean, I'm assuming that's how it works in the States. You have absolutely no idea, but that's certainly how it works here.
You're pretty close.
Yeah, you have the sort of towns and district levels that run the local, the rubbish collection and that kind of thing, but all the big ticket items are run by larger kind of county-based organizations. And so I ran for, I'm not really a politician, I'm a political activist. I knock on doors and in my community and try and find problems to solve. That's my politics. And so I found it really useful to run for election, even though running for election is a right pain in the backside to do. It gives you the ability to actually fix some of these problems, rather than having to pass them up the chain, which is often what you have to do if you're somebody that just knocks on doors. I was able to pick up casework with these big organisations like care homes or children's services. The casework was often quite interesting. It was people who were often in touch with the county council department, but had got, for some reason or another, had kind of fallen through the cracks, or they'd had an adverse decision against them. And these can have really serious consequences. If you're a carer for, say, a disabled relative or something, and suddenly your allowance is cut off, that can have major consequences both for you and for the person you're caring for. I mean, of course, turns your life on its head. So I found, and that often the rules are weird and based on how the world used to work rather than the work. And often the decision makers don't have much discretion to interpret the rules in a more flexible way. So trying to that's when having a training as a lawyer often helped, as I was able to kind of navigate these a little bit and kind of see where there are gaps that the decision could be reversed in a more favorable way to my resident.
Your advocacy work has never really stopped, but as far as an elected position, you did eventually walk away from it. What was it that motivated you to stop doing that?
It was a variety of things, but COVID was the main thing. I had to move house, but that was okay. Because of a relative and a situation, I had to move house to be near the relative. And so, but it was okay because I could commute between the two relatively easily. I still had a flat in my, an apartment in my ward. And so I was able to, go from one to the other, and that all worked fairly well. And then COVID happened and that was no longer possible. And I found I was, for an unknown period of time, I was going to have to try and work by remote control. It just didn't feel right. So I found somebody in my ward who was a really excellent campaigner and really passionate about it, and I asked him if he would take over from me. And so I then supported him in his election, and luckily he got elected and is doing a great job.
So I need to ask, with all of that, all of a sudden Blur decides, let's get back together. Let's perform some dates. Let's tour a little bit. Tell me about how that comes about for you. I mean, obviously you've got other things going on. You've got a record coming out. You mentioned you have some refugees living in your house. Things are pretty busy for you right now. The idea of getting back on the road sounds like an awful lot to take on.
Yeah, I always have an awful lot going on, to be honest. It's not much different, to be honest. But the idea was floated some years ago. Actually, it was the people that run Wembley Stadium suggested that we might like to play a show there, and everybody was like, maybe, who knows? Let's see what happens. Kick the can down the road as you do, obviously can't do it this year, can't do it next year, or maybe we'll do it, and they kick the can down the road so far that COVID happened, and then suddenly we couldn't do it at all, and that was really at the point when everybody could, the first opportunity that we really had where everybody was free and available and willing. So then we got a bit of a grudge, that stopped us. COVID has stopped us doing, so that kind of toughened everyone's resolve. But then post-COVID, suddenly playing shows was very, very difficult. Still is, and the UK had left the EU. A lot of the music industry relied on workers from around Europe coming over, and suddenly that they'd all gone home, and it was just all kinds of problems. So whereas these big shows, how they work, as it turns out, I only found this out by going through this process with Wembley, but how it works is you express an interest in a certain, we don't, but our agent expresses an interest in a certain date, and you go on a waiting list, you see. So ordinarily there might be 2 or 3 bands on the waiting list for each day when it's available for a music performance. And then at some point, one of the bands will go, right, let's push the button. And so then the stadium goes to the waiting list and goes from the top and says, right, this band has pushed the button. Are you in or are you out? We're out. Okay, next. This band has pushed the button. Are you in or are you out? We're out. Next. And then if you're lucky, the band that has decided to push the button, everybody else will drop out, and they will get the gig. If they're unlucky, the first band goes, oh, really? Oh, yeah, in that case, yes, we're in. So, but that normally works in normal times because, you'd express an interest in 3 or 4 dates and you'd probably get one of them. Well, post-COVID, there were like 15 in the waiting list on each date, minimum. So you could express an interest in half a dozen shows, and the likelihood is you'd still get none of them. So then we were like, oh my God, this is not going to happen, is it? What on earth is going on here? It's like the universe is trying to stop the band getting back together again. So that went on for years, to the point where I rang round everybody and I said, look, I've just spoken to our agent. I'm afraid it's not going to happen for another year. We're going to have to, put it all on hold. Maybe we'll try again next year. Maybe we'll have better luck next year. And everybody went, oh, well, that's disappointing. Oh, well, never mind. We're used to it now. Kick it forward another year. 2 days later, the agent rang me and said, no, it's going ahead. It's going ahead. No, you've got one of the dates. I don't know how, but you've got one of the dates.
Yeah, and you're going to sell it out in 2 minutes.
Well, that was the next thing. We thought, well, is anybody even going to care? You're right. So we've got this Wembley date. Is anybody even going to care? And our agent said he thought they would, but you could never be sure because some big bands, like a big band had just announced a tour and sold 500,000 tickets in about 5 minutes, But some other big bands had just announced a tour and then had to cancel it quietly a few months later when nobody was interested. It's like, well, which category do we fall in? So luckily we fell in the first category, but it was touch and go. And we were all kind of, certainly I was on the edge of my seat when the tickets went on sale, going, what's going to happen? But then, so I logged in as if I wanted to buy a ticket, and the agent had explained that there would be a waiting list, and depending on how many people had already logged in, you'd be in your queue. And so I logged in at the witching hour when the tickets went on sale, and immediately I was number 43,000 in the queue. I thought, we're there. Okay, that's it. I shut the laptop, walked away, the job done. And then, as luck would have it, I don't know if luck's quite the right word, but anyway, there was a charity concert on the day after. They were a big charity were trying to put a benefit show on. And so they've been negotiating with us. We say, well, we've got a stage in there. Do you want to use our stage? We can use the lights. We could split some costs and, make it all a bit more easier for both of us. Trucking costs, we'll pay the thing to come and you pay for it to be taken away. Great. So it's great. We've got something to do the day after. We go to this charity event, you see, and then our gig sold out. And then the charity phoned and said, oh, yeah, we can't do it anymore. This, that, and the other has happened. Yeah, we're going to pull out. So then the agent rang and said, they're asking if you want to do a second date at Wembley. So you've got the stage there, you've got the lights there, that's all going to be there anyway. You want to do another date?
Is that nearly sold out too?
It's doing well. I don't know exactly how well, but it'll certainly sell out by the time we turn up.
I think one of the things that's actually really encouraging to hear. I mean, first of all, yes, you're bidding for venues and all that other stuff, but to me, it's more encouraging to know that the four of you are still getting along. It's not like there's any real infighting that would you got to negotiate between the four of you to say, do we want to do it while one guy does and two guys don't. It's you guys are still pretty much a united front. That's kind of a cool thing and unheard of after 35 plus years.
We have our moments, but by and large, and there's normally the things that stand in the way are, number one, everybody's very busy, so a gig is never a gig. A gig takes a year. You've got to do all this other stuff to run up to a show. Then, there's other tours go in and all this. So we know from long experience, if somebody comes along and says, do you want to play a gig over there? What they're asking is, do you want to spend a year doing Blur? That's all they're asking. So that's a very different question to be able to say yes to. So, when they say that, they're normally talking quite a long time in the future so that the diaries can be cleared. And the second thing is, we don't want to repeat ourselves. So the thing has to be an interesting thing that they're suggesting. Otherwise, it's like, well, we've done that, Yeah. Somebody had run up and said, do you want to headline the Isle of Wight Festival? We've done the Isle of Wight Festival. It's a lovely festival. It was great fun, but do we, do you want to do that again? So people are looking for, our agent is always looking for interesting things that will tempt us back out on the road again. And of course, originally it was 2009, I think, was the first sort of reunion show, if that is such a thing. But that was when in Hyde Park, this big park in the centre of London, they just started putting on shows, like first time ever, put on big rock shows, and they wanted to know if we would headline the first of these shows. So it's like a mini festival right in the centre of London. Amazing thing. And they said, do you want to headline the first one? We said, cool, you can't say no to that. That's like, we're setting up a festival in your hometown. Do you want to headline it? The only answer to that is yes. 2012 was when London won the Olympics. Again, we got this call. They're asking if you want to headline the party at the end of the Olympics. What were you going to say? You're going to say no to that? Of course you want to headline the party at the end of the Olympics. So all of these things, that they're the things that make us sit upright, get excited again about the project and, the possibilities. And Wembley was one of those. It's an iconic thing. Never done it, probably never likely to do it with any of our other projects, I would imagine. And it's like, Madison Square Garden or the Hollywood Bowl or Budokan in Tokyo is one of those sort of iconic things that you saw on album sleeves when you were a kid, it just seemed like a crazy thing that was impossible for normal mortals to achieve, and then they're offering it to us.
So the final question has to be, is this an indicator that new music could come out? I mean, are you guys talking about maybe writing songs together and producing something, or is this just touring at this moment?
Something will happen, I'm sure. Quite what remains to be seen. But usually when we do live shows, we like to have some new music to play. So we'll just have to see. It's early days. We've just really put the tour to bed. There's some more dates to announce later on in that year, which we're just sorting out now. And yes, I think then thoughts will turn to what else we might do, and we shall see.
Well, I hope they're going to give you at least a little bit of time to play something from radio songs.
Sadly, I think this year is now spoken for. That was my that was my vague plan, was to take it on tour in the summer, but sadly some other project intervened. I'll be taking that on tour in the summer instead. So next year now, I should put another solo album out in the spring next year and start and do as much touring next year as I possibly can.
Dave, it's great. It's great to talk to you. You know, best of luck with the record. Like I said, I think Radio Songs is a fantastic effort on your part. Really, really like that record, and it's good to have Blur back too. So,
thank you very much. Very nice to talk to you.
Nice talking to you too, Dave. Thank you very much. The name of Dave Rowntree's new record is called Radio Days, and it really is fantastic. Keep your eyes out for additional tour dates and new music from Blur, maybe sometime within the next year. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, feel free to share it, like it, review it, and tell all your friends about it. You can reach me at Baxie@rock102.com. I'd love to know what you think. And thanks again for listening to Baxie's Musical Podcast.